Dr. Simone Gold, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Kim.
You are, you're one of the most prominent faces of the COVID pushback era. I don't even know what to call it. I don't know. People label it a bunch of different ways, like the COVID skeptics or the anti-mandate crowd, but there was just I don't, I don't know what the proper label is. The people who were right about COVID, right? That's
Yeah, we
what we
should we
can.
should we should come up with our own catchy title.
Right. But you were one of the most prominent faces, and you are such a hero to so many people coming out there and being as brave as you have been, not just during that time, but continue to be very, very brave. It is just an honor to really talk to you. Honestly, just having followed you all of these years now, can you believe it's been years
Oh,
since
yeah.
it all started? Let's talk about your background. You are a brilliant woman. Um, Tell us about you have both a medical degree and a law degree from prominent institutions, but you started medical school really young, like 19 years old. Is that right? Did you, how old were
Yeah.
you when you went to college?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, right? So my father was a doctor, and he was very adamant that all of his children should become doctors. So in fact, three for three, we did all become doctors. So I started medical school. I started college very young and medical school even younger. I started college when I was 16 and I finished in 3 years. And then I started medical school at 19 and I finished in the usual 4 years. So I was 23 when I graduated medical school. And the year I graduated, it happened I was the youngest physician in America.
Did you go off to residency?
Yeah, so the normal course is after you finish medical school, you get your MD degree, so you can put the MD after your name. But after
Mhm.
that, you have to do some kind of specialty training, and that's called residency. And I went off to be an emergency medicine physician with that training. However, I zigzagged. I went to law school in between, so I did not go right off to residency. It's a very unusual story. I doubt in the whole rest of your life you'll ever hear a similar story.
Where
But
did you do your
but I was
where did you do your medical school training? Well, where are you
I
from
was in
originally?
I'm born and raised in New York, and I lived there until I was 19, and I lived at home through college. I was very sheltered, as a child and as a young lady, very sheltered. My father is Eastern European, and in fact, it's quite relevant. He was a Holocaust survivor, and it contributed very much to my upbringing, who I became later. But I lived in New York, and then I went to medical school, Chicago Medical School. And as I was leaving medical school and deciding not to go to residency, I went off to Stanford Law School.
Okay. So then you go to
Yeah.
Stanford Law School because one degree, one prestigious degree wasn't enough. And clearly, you're obviously some sort of a genius. I mean, to graduate high school so young, to go off to college and then medical school and off to Stanford Law School. I mean, just absolutely
I'll share with you.
phenomenal.
I'll share with you just something funny. It's like I think I mean, I was blessed with the intellect that God gave me, but when I look back on my life, I think I was being a little bit rebellious. I remember saying to my dad, I didn't want to only be a doctor, and I think the most imaginative thing I could think of was I'll also be a lawyer. I mean, I know that sounds very funny, but there's some truth. And in my mind, I thought, oh, I will fix the healthcare system, and I will learn all about law and how the system works, it was kind of a hazy ambition. I was young, I had the time, I had the energy, and yeah. But it is a little funny, just to jump ahead for just 1 second. It's a little funny later on in life during the COVID years, people on the other side who were mocking me would call me a quack, and I have to say I never took that seriously. I never even really got upset because nobody would ever call me a quack.
So you go to law school, you get out of law school, and then did you go to residency or did you go off to work in law?
No, yeah. So that's when I think I just, I was 23 to 26, 27. So I was starting to really think, what do I really want to do with my life? So I did decide to go back into medicine. And it was really because I thought that a career in law um, maybe had a lot of, maybe it wasn't quite as honorable in my mind. I really knew
Hmm.
that being a doctor, as my dad was a doctor, was just a really honorable way to spend your life. I did a couple stints in various legal environments 2 times in my life, actually in Washington, D.C. And I really was quite discouraged. I thought it was dishonest. I thought you couldn't really get something ethical and honorable done. And that's actually why I reverted back to medicine. So I did my
And
training then in emergency, and then I did my training in emergency medicine.
At where did you do your residency?
Yeah, and that's another zigzag. I've lived all over the nation. I'm kind of like a military brat, but I'm an education brat. So I moved all
Yeah.
over the country for my education. So I ended up in my residency training in Southern Virginia, Eastern Virginia Medical Center, not too far from North Carolina. So I'm so sorry. I'm getting my training mixed up. I was there for 1 year, and then I did the rest of my training in New York.
Okay. So you can't even, yeah, you've done so much training,
A
so much
lot. It's a
schooling
lot.
that you can't even keep track of your schooling. That's great. That's great. Which did you like better? Did you like medical school better or law school?
Yeah, so that's such a great question. So they are so, so different. Medical school, and again, this is all with the perspective of what happened during COVID, because a lot of people have asked me what the differences were. So, first of all, very few people do what I've done, get a medical degree and a law degree. And it is not primarily because they take a long time, because there's a lot of MD PhDs. There's a fair
Hmm.
number of MDs with a master's degree, also, like in public health or in business administration. There's almost no MD JDs, doctor lawyers. And it's really because the type of intellect is so different. It's like being bilingual. And for some reason, it's easy for me to be both. But they're very different. Medical school was a lot of memorization and a lot of regurgitation. So you really had a
Hmm.
huge volume of material you had to learn, and you had to know it at a high level, and you had to be able to parrot it back. I would say the first 2 years of med school was entirely memorization and regurgitation. And then the second 2 years, when you're in the hospital with patients, there's a little bit more intellectual creativity, but very little. You always had senior doctors over you, and you really were learning at the bedside with them. And in retrospect, and in comparison to studying law, it was very protocolized. It was very cookbook cutter.
Mm.
I didn't think of it until I went to law school. In law school, it was a lot more um, creative, intellectual arguing. You would read a lot of old cases, precedent cases, and then you'd have to argue it and come up with your own creative arguments and which was right and which was wrong. Very, very different. And this came up a lot during COVID when I was wondering why doctors didn't push back, why they didn't think creatively, why were they just following the herd and following like sheep. And I thought back on my training and I said, oh, well, not only we were not only selected to do that in our training, but we were very rewarded for doing that. I mean, the better you could regurgitate, really, in a way, the more accolades you got. Very different than law. So I happen to enjoy law school much more than I enjoyed medical school.
So interesting that to have that
Yeah.
perspective to and you are in a very unique position to be able to have gone through both and then to see that there was a type of basically indoctrination almost of the doctors. I mean, it's not, I don't know if that's the right word, but it was but like you're saying, it was just like just regurgitate, just ingest and regurgitate, ingest and regurgitate. And that really played out during COVID. I mean, we saw that so much, and you were able to spot that because you had also done other types of schooling and said, well, it's not like that in all the, that's how this is, but there's other fields and other ways of life that teach you how to actually use your brain and critically think. And it's unfortunate that our doctors are not being taught to critically think. You would think that that would be something needed just to diagnose things that,
Yeah.
might
So
not be textbook exactly.
I actually think this is almost the most important thing we can talk about today is the differences because I've taken a lot of time reflecting on this. And it wasn't always this way. My father is a doctor and I grew up all in the world of medicine. I used to go with him to the hospitals and the nursing homes. We had an office in our house where he saw patients in the evening and on the weekends. I was very immersed in medicine all of my life. It was not this way. It was not this way when I was a child observing him. And then it's gotten worse and worse every year and worse every decade in terms of following a protocol and cookbook. It was not like that in the past.
Hmm.
But I've thought about it so deeply because it was so alarming that the doctors who had the capacity to know what was going on during the COVID years chose not to listen. They also chose not to read medical journals. I mean, the medical
Hmm.
journals were there, but their peers were not reading it, so they were not reading it. And I found it really baffling. And you never would have really gotten away with that with a lawyer because a lawyer is hired by an individual client and they have to research that subject and come up with an argument for that subject. But doctors were being told what to do, and that felt very, very comfortable for them. That's a
Hmm.
tragedy for us as a people.
When do you think the shift happened? You say that you saw this, when your dad was a doctor, it wasn't like this. And then at what point do you think it shifted and why do you think it was?
It wasn't sudden. It's been incremental, but it there was a few times. I think in the 80s it shifted a bit. I think around the early 2000s, and the very, very big shift came with Obamacare because there
Mm,
was such a weapon. With Obamacare, I do think that was the death of physician independence. I wasn't particularly political really until COVID, but I remember in 2008, I despised candidate Obama because of his ACA, Affordable Care Act. I
mm,
knew it was going to ruin medicine. There have been a lot of troubles before that with us just following the herd. But once you made all of our payments really subordinate to government, that was it. We just
really?
became like widgets almost, government widgets.
I would almost think the shift happened when, and I don't know when this shift was, but you being also an attorney would maybe know when the medical system was, when it just, doctors could just be sued constantly for anything. And it just, at that point, when you think like a lawyer, right? The thought is just go do whatever, just take the safe route, like the safest route possible, and that's what you should do. So the safest would be to just follow the protocol. Whatever you're told, you just regurgitate it. Like that's what it is, that's what we're doing. And that's the safest path so that you don't end up with a medical malpractice or some sort of lawsuit against you.
Sort of. I see why you see that, but it is a factor as to why physicians were so susceptible, right? They did learn to be very risk averse to reduce their own um, liability and their own unpleasantness in their life. But the medical malpractice crisis has been going on really my entire life, where I would say from the 70s, 80s, right?
Hmm.
But this shift where doctors really just looked at what Facebook and what, for example, we, as a practicing doctor, we didn't consult with what the CDC said. We didn't consult with what the FDA said. That's crazy. It may not seem that way to you, but I can tell you,
Hmm.
as doctors, that's not how we think. We practice, we learn, we know our material, we talk to our colleagues, we read the journals. We don't check to see what the FDA or the CDC is saying. And all of a sudden, my peers in 2020 were just parroting that, and I found it strange. So I think they were susceptible to that because we've been so rewarded, I'd say for 2, 3 decades, just to follow the herd. And it did get much worse after the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think would have been a better alternative? I mean, I don't know, and not that I'm
Uh,
particularly for the affordable. I mean, I don't know, honestly, I don't know enough about our system, how it works, what the damage has been, nor do I know enough about other countries' systems. I know our system is broken. That's something I do know,
our system is
right?
terrible. I feel so strongly. I mean, really, if I had a path that I am trying to pursue, it's to fix the healthcare system. Our healthcare
Yeah.
system is just terrible. It is incorrect to say it's the best in the world. That's not true. However, socialized medicine is actually even worse. So
Mm,
that's not the answer either. The answer is you have to have the doctor patient relationship has to be the center of all of it. You have to do everything to protect that. Right now, we have payers in the middle. We've got the government in the middle, and the government tells private payers what to do. So the patient themselves doesn't even think in terms anymore of the doctor patient relationship. The patient writes a check to Blue Cross every month or to Kaiser every month. And then if they need something, they go to this insurance paid doctor essentially, and they expect the doctor to always tell them the truth. I don't think so. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. It's not really relevant, the person in front of them. So the answer is there's multiple ways to get there, but the
mhm.
priority has to be in the doctor patient relationship. And we've gotten entirely away from that.
Yeah, I wonder how you develop that. But I see what you're saying. I mean, I don't feel like right. I feel like I have a bigger relationship with my insurance company than with
You do.
with the
You
doctors,
do.
because with the insurance company, you're just sitting there like, okay, how much is this going to cost me? They're sending the bills. They're the ones you're communicating with. Like, you
And
just
let
go
me
to the
tell you who
doctor
got
and Go ahead.
Who gets better care? It's people who get better care are people who don't use insurance companies. And by the way, there's a way to have that, and it's too much for this conversation probably, but I'm going to shock you, and I'm going to shock all you viewers. I, Dr. Simone Gold, have not had health insurance for more than 10 years. I've always known the health insurance industry is a racket. It not only is it very expensive, so you're not getting like the financial benefit, which is really why you buy insurance, but it reduces your freedom and reduces your choices. So as a physician, I always knew if I ever needed help in the medical space, I was going to want to pick my doctors, right? I was a knowledgeable insider. I didn't want an insurance company interfering with that. What I wanted was a financial safety net, right? If you come down with a catastrophic diagnosis or an accident, you need a financial safety net. Well, there were ways to do that outside the insurance model. So I will talk with you maybe offline and explain that to you, but I've also built a company around this concept. It's called goldcare.com. And we're not really here to talk about that. But my answer to you is the insurance company has gotten in the middle, and that enabled doctors in 2020 not to tell their patients the truth because they weren't answering to the patient. They were answering to the insurance company, which is above them is the government.
Yeah.
So doctors, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely, I think people feel like the insurance companies are certainly in the middle. There was this video that was recently trending. It was a dad whose daughter needed to go to the emergency room and they had an ambulance ride. And he got the bill from the ambulance company and it was like $600. And then he got the bill from insurance and it was like $1,300. And he or from the ambulance company, but after insurance adjustment, and it was $1,300. He's like, wait a minute, how did the insurance adjustment make
Yes.
my bill almost over double? And they explained, well, the $600 was if you're not insured. And because the
Right.
real bill was like 2,500, but without insurance, we would just make you pay 600. But if you have insurance, it's the full 2,500 and your insurance covered this much of it. So now you're left with 1,300. And he's like, I want to go back to well, let's just pretend I don't have insurance. And they said, well, too bad. We know you have insurance. So it is, you have to pay the
So
$1,300.
I saw that video too. You have
Yeah.
stumbled on the secret of why you can and must exit the insurance model. There are ways around it, but once you're in the insurance model, your options are worse. How do you like
Yeah.
that? Your options are worse. So it's one of my missions is to get people off insurance. It's one of the reasons I built goldcare.com. You'll look at it later. And
Yeah.
the insurance industry really exists to make money. But during COVID, we saw that they were dictating policy, not your best interest. And that's the part I can't forgive the doctors for.
Yeah. When it comes to, I mean, I know you're not here to talk about gold health, but just a quick question on that is, I've talked to other companies probably similar. Um, it's really only for younger, healthy people though. Like once you get to a certain age, then it's like, okay, it's not really, we're not able to, and I even know private companies that offer this type of insurance, well, big, large corporations that they don't offer their employees insurance. They have basically a pool where everybody puts money into the pool. And then the company itself has its own staff that negotiates the bills, basically insuranceless. So they'll just go and say, all right, what's the bill? And then they negotiate. And then, yeah, they have all the selection of the doctors and the specialists and all of that, and it is cheaper and everybody likes their health insurance from that company. It's way better. It's, and it's a company kind of focused thing. So I know that that type of stuff works. It works really well. But again, with this company, like they don't employ anybody over the age of 65, for example. Their employees are younger. And so
You,
what happens when you're old and you've got all of these, you've got diabetes and heart failure and you've got all these issues?
So yeah, first of all, I could talk about goldcare.com day and night because it is the solution for independent minded people who want honest answers, better solutions that are less expensive. I
Hmm.
think what you're describing was self-insurance. So if you're a large company, you can do self-insurance and that is a viable way to go. But for other people, you purchase, and this is what I did instead of insurance for many, many years. You go to a health share. Now there are a lot of health shares out there, and the health shares kind of pool their resources, but they're not insurance and they work much more honorably. It is true that health shares don't take if you're over 65. But the answer, if you're over 65, is to keep your Medicare. You've paid into it, right? But
Hmm.
go into your Medicare doctor appointment as an educated customer. During COVID, I directly saw, and I can attest to, doctors were giving Medicare patients lethal protocols. Lethal. I
Mm.
mean, it was crazy. So if you've got Medicare, keep your Medicare, but go into your Medicare doctor armed with good information. So Gold Care does that. So it is
Okay.
true if you're over 65, health shares are not for you. But if you're under 65, you can go with a health share and we'll show you how. And I definitely encourage you to do it. Another
Yeah.
reason is because insurance industry is actually was heavily behind the mandates. That's something I learned during COVID. I didn't realize it. They were, we thought of, big pharma as like the bad guy, but actually the insurance companies in many ways were much worse. They were really behind the mandates. And I just won't ever put my money towards an insurance company. I won't do it.
Yeah. I probably next year I am gonna switch over to some sort of a share
I'll
system
show you
rather than
how.
doing
I'm telling you.
yeah.
Join us. We'll show you how. We made it like really, really easy.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll definitely check it out. But what would the insurance, what would be their motivation? Is it similar to like the doctors that are saying, well, I don't want to take any risks, so yeah, to just get the shot because that's what I'm told, so you do what I'm told. And I mean, were the
So,
insurance companies kind of taking that same stance?
you mean why they didn't do right by their patients?
Well,
So,
why they were for the mandates? Was it because in their mind they were like, well, the medical community
oh,
is saying this is going to stop the spread. We don't want people with the spread because that costs us more money. So I guess you got to do it.
yeah, well, first of all, they're just woke and on the left. I mean, that was just like their baseline.
Okay.
But for instance, I sued Kaiser in 2021 because they were forcing all their Kaiser employees to get the shot. And in that discovery is when I learned that Kaiser was behind the vaccine mandate in California. And when we found out why, it was because there was about 4,000 Kaiser employees who didn't want to take the shot, but they were in contract negotiation and their union was negotiating for them not to have to take the shot. And if the government of California made the shot mandatory for everyone in the state and Kaiser didn't have to do it, then all of their workers would have no other option of anywhere else they could work. All of these Kaiser workers wanted to just leave Kaiser and go to different places. So Kaiser went to Newsom, essentially. I'm making it short, but essentially Kaiser went to Newsom and Newsom said, let's have vaccine mandates. But it suited Kaiser's business perspective. Like they did an end run around the union.
That's insane.
I
And
mean, I saw the evidence. I
and you
kept
know
that
who
lawsuit.
figured that out? That's the lawyers that figured it out, to your point of I don't think it's
No,
as
no, that's what I'm saying.
honorable.
Like, that was our lawsuit. That was our lawsuit because so in that, I didn't know I was going to discover that. We just went to represent all the Kaiser people
Right.
who didn't want to lose their job. They just wanted permission. But in that lawsuit, I learned that Kaiser was actually behind the mandates. And I'm like,
Yeah.
huh, that's
Right.
interesting.
Well, yeah, because
Yeah.
they figured out a legal workaround in order to yeah, I mean that's it's
Advance
smart.
their
I
own.
mean, from a
Yes,
legal
exactly.
perspective, it's very that's very smart. If you're wanting to bust if you're wanting to do some union busting, that's one way to do it, I suppose.
It was, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, it was perfectly fine. They were following their own financial self interest. It's just that me, as a patient, a client, a member,
Yeah.
I step out of that nonsense. I mean, I don't need to have that kind of business relationship.
Right, but that is so insane that that was the reason why they were pushing for
Yeah.
mandates. I mean, I would think it was just because they didn't want the liability. Well, what if something happens and this is but wow, just for union busting?
Well,
That's why that's crazy.
it was that was a practical thing that we found in the lawsuit. But in addition, the vehemence against there was just a lot of pressure on everybody in the business world to let these shots make a lot of money, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It just so happened that when I was writing for hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, one of the hospitals I was working at had a big Kaiser contract also coincidentally, and they didn't want me to prescribe it, which made no sense to me in 2020. I'm like, why wouldn't, this will be cheaper for you. Your patient will do better. They won't have to be hospitalized. It'll be a whole lot cheaper. They didn't want it. And they didn't want it because they wanted the shots to come out. So I think there's a lot of deal making behind the scenes
Jeez.
between top CEOs.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's like, well, this will be good for me and good for you, so let's do it. It'll make a lot of money. So let's all get in on it. Wow, that's terrible. Tell us how you
it
ended
is.
up being one of the main faces of COVID, the COVID pushback, the how you started America's Frontline Doctors. There's of course that very infamous press conference that happened in Washington D.C. You were there. There were many other doctors that were. I think Dr. Pierre Corey was there as well. Dr. Latipo, I believe, was in that.
Mhm.
So some
Correct.
really great voices. how did you, what happened that led from you're a doctor, you're trying to write prescriptions, they're telling you no, and then you end up kind of the face.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot. So I was working in the ERs I was working at two ERs. I divorced, raising my two kids, just a normal life. 2020 comes around and I'm paying attention because I'm an emergency doctor and I know that these will be my future patients. So I was reading all the research that came from all over the world. And within a few months, I pretty much knew everything that there was. And I was figuring out that what the government was saying was very, very different than what the research articles were saying. For example, all across the world, we knew that hydroxychloroquine was helpful because there were studies from China. By the way, China studied chloroquine. It became official policy in China that you should use chloroquine for this disease. How do you like that for new information? Italy, France, all these places. And then our government was saying, don't use it. So that was strange. Our government was saying that our hospitals were overwhelmed. Well, that was strange. It was overwhelmed for short periods of time in specific areas. So it was overwhelmed for a little time in New York, a little time in New Orleans, like that. But overwhelmingly, the hospitals were not overwhelmed. In fact, we were empty. I started doing videos. I had maybe five people on Twitter, but I would go to the hospital parking lots and I'd be like, look at the hospital parking lot, guys. There's nobody here. There was literally nobody. I've never in my career had no patients. No patients, no patients. So there were so many things that the government was saying that wasn't true that I just
Hmm.
started speaking out. And that's what happened. And then I started getting censored, which was very strange. It was very strange. So I started looking for other doctors like me. I knew I couldn't be the only one. And I found them one by one on social media. And I said, how can we get this out to the American people? And honestly, Kim, back then, I really just wanted to save lives. I was really upset that our doctors and government I knew was really killing people, quite frankly. Um, and so I said, well, let's do a press conference and get a lot of attention. So I invited in influencers and doctors. So we had a whole bunch of doctors and a whole bunch of influencers. We stood on the steps of the Supreme Court and we told people the truth. And I don't know if you saw that video in real time, but we got 20 million views in 8 hours, which is a record, an absolute record by a lot. And then
Hmm.
at 8 hours, they just maybe less, everyone took it off Facebook, YouTube,
Yeah.
Instagram. I mean, it was just deplatformed immediately. But enough people had seen it that the trajectory of my life changed. So that's exactly how it happened. And really, I was just offended that our government policies and our media were killing people.
Yeah.
So,
Did you get, I mean, did anything happen to you consequentially with your medical license or anything along those lines?
what happened to me after that moment, just everything that you can imagine could happen to a person happened to a person. I got fired. I had been working at two ERs. I got fired. And just want to say that once you've been trained, board certified, residency trained in emergency medicine, you never think you're not going to do it. You're well paid. It's very specialized work. I knew that I wouldn't be hireable elsewhere. So I was worried. I was scared how I'd earn a living. That's the truth. Everyone came after me. The California Medical Board came after me. Later on in my career, where I am as a lawyer, my lawyer license was attacked. Congress came after me. That's not well known. Congress came after me for quote unquote disinformation over ivermectin. Um, I mean, the attacks were fast and furious and quite overwhelming, except that on the other side, half the nation or more was flocking to me and turning to me as a trusted resource. So I went from being completely anonymous, and in 1 week, I had 105,000 people following me on Twitter, which
Yeah.
is, totally anonymous to 105,000 is
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
radical.
So you were fired. Isn't that interesting? They fire emergency medicine doctor during a time that they're saying they need emergency medical doctors and nurses, and they're firing you.
It was very strange to be in my shoes. I mean, I literally remember when people used to clap for healthcare workers, when we
Yeah.
went to work every night at 8 or 9 p.m., people would stand on their balconies and clap. So I
Yeah.
was one of those people because I'd leave my home, I'd be in my scrubs, and people would clap for me. That was my reality. And then after I came out publicly, on the steps of the Supreme Court, I literally was fired. There was like 75 nasty articles written about me. I only know that because we collected them. We thought we would sue for defamation. I mean, but everyone piled on: the AP, the HuffPost, ABC, NBC, CNN, MSNBC. I mean, you can still find videos of me of people saying, quack, disinformation. There's a lot of articles, I should lose my medical license. Do you understand? People were saying I should lose my medical license because I spoke words they didn't like. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a crazy thing. I was very worried. I was very worried as a lawyer that we were slipping into tyranny. That's
Yeah.
what kept me going in this fight. You know,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what
Well,
motivated me.
we
That
were
free
slipping
speech.
into tyranny.
Yeah,
I think that
yeah.
there's no doubt about that. Um, so, but you didn't lose your license. So after, I mean, but losing your job and having people come after you, I mean, were you devastated? How did it? I mean, we look at you now and we say, "Oh, what a hero!" And those of us from the outside, when that was happening to you, we're cheering you on and saying, "This is a real hero. This is a real fighter." But for you personally, it must have been devastating
It was incredibly
or
difficult.
stressful.
And also, well, first of all, why do you go to grad school and get all these degrees? You think that there's a social construct between me and my nation that I will be kind of protected after that. I've put in 10, 15 years of training. I never expected to be unemployed or unemployable. I mean, that was shocking. In my personal life, a lot of people were angry at me. I stopped having friendships with lots of people. Um, in my home life, there was a division in my family over what had happened. And mind you, I went out to speak publicly, but I didn't know how big it would be. It was a watershed moment. It was I can't really describe it. It was but let's focus on the positive, which is I knew why I was speaking. I knew the government was doing wrong. I knew the media was doing wrong. And I had the vision of human beings who needed my help, who had come to me as a physician, and I would write them a prescription, and my hospital was reprimanding me. So it was very real to me. This wasn't an abstract fight. This was really people who needed doctors to step up. So I never considered reversing course. But yes, it was very difficult.
I couldn't even imagine the stress of losing your job and dealing with all of that, and then not being employable. How did you make it from that point forward? Then, did you get
So
another
it's
job?
it's kind of yeah, it's kind of a no. I'm absolutely probably to this day, except maybe in Texas or Florida, I'm probably unemployable for what I was trained to do, which is hospital work. Of course, I can go out and do my own practice, but you're better off, be paid in the hospital. So there's just no way. Obviously, I wasn't following hospital rules, So I was worried about ever making a living. So something happened. So this was July 27th when all of a sudden, I became well known. And in the month of August, I was invited to do an interview by what turns out was a very large network. And I never knew them. I never heard of them. But in the middle of that show, and it was Daystar, they were kind of impressed with what I was saying. And I think they ascertained I was for real. So the interviewer turned to the audience and microphone, and he said that he would double any donations that came my way. And I was really shocked. And I didn't know if he was serious or not. But about a month or 2 months later, I received a check from them, and it was about $160,000. And
Wow.
I remember thinking, okay, well, I can do this for a few months because I needed help. I had to hire people. And also, these were small donations, $30, $20, $50. I remember thinking a lot of people wanted to hear what I had to say. I mean, again, from my perspective, what I was saying was obvious. I didn't know how important this would be to other people, but it turned out it was really important.
It certainly was. That's for sure. Um,
That gave
so
me
things,
that gave me that energy to keep going.
yeah. So things have worked out from that point for the better. Would you say for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's you really can't step back into a corrupt system. I mean, when I think about my life now, I could not work for a hospital. I mean, they're getting their orders above me, and if I've got a patient in front of me, I have to do what I think is right. I can't do what you tell me. Maybe
Yeah.
they merge sometimes, but on that 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 that it doesn't match, how am I not supposed to help the person in front of me? It's a higher calling to be a doctor, in my opinion.
You say your siblings and your dad is a doctor. What do they think of you?
Yeah.
Do they
So
agree
my
with
dad
you or?
passed. I think my dad would have been exceedingly proud. He was actually a Holocaust survivor, so he
Yeah.
understands about living on lies. Lies don't work in the long run.
Right.
But no, my siblings. No, they're very much on the other side.
Oh, they are.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it turns out it's not an education thing, right? It's really a personality compliance sort of decision. And doctors have really been self-selected to be very obedient and compliant. After reflecting on this for years, Kim, I'm convinced that doctors are worse than average American citizens.
Well, I mean, I guess you guys fit the statistic because it's about one third of the people were against the mandate. So, like one third of the people resisted the groupthink, and in your family, I guess one third of you, one out of the three of you resisted the
Yeah,
groupthink. Oh, geez, that's tough. I mean, the family thing is tough. I had family members also that shunned me
yeah.
and outcast me, and you know, I mean, now they're back, right? I mean, they're back around because they were wrong, and they don't want to ever admit that. But at the same time, I didn't kill
By the way,
grandma,
can we talk
you know.
about that? Can we talk about that for a second? Like, why can't they admit it? Like, the other side never will admit that they were wrong. I mean, all the evidence in the world is there, and it's really hard to proceed. And I think about the nation. How do we proceed as a nation unless you stand on what was wrong, say it was wrong, and then then you can be forgiven, and then you can move on. But
Right,
they
right.
they didn't, they didn't, and they don't.
Yeah, you're right. They don't, and it's so. I mean, they all got the shot like how many times, and they still got COVID how many times, and it, I mean, and the people around them that didn't get the vaccine still got COVID and survived and were fine. I mean, there were people that definitely were weaker, and it didn't work out, just like with many other illnesses. But yeah, you're right. They just
And
cannot say
And I just want to establish the facts really quickly because I'm sure you agree with me. And I don't like when people say, I didn't take COVID seriously. I took COVID exactly as seriously as any other disease I saw in the ER. It does exist. It is a disease. There is a virus that causes it. But the people that did badly had the average person who died from COVID had 4 comorbidities and was already over the age of a life expectancy in this nation. Life expectancy in this nation is either it's like 76 or 78. And the
mm,
people who died, the average age was like 78 and a half plus 4 comorbidities. So, in other words, if you were frail, if you were elderly, if you were at the end of your days, COVID absolutely could take you out. And the patients I took care of who were very sick with COVID that did do badly were typically diabetics or and on dialysis. Like those are the people that did very badly. But middle age and even healthy older people, and certainly children, did not do badly. And that was the foundational lie that they said to people that everyone should be afraid. No, no, no. You needed to protect what I would call the frail elderly or just like the frail
yeah.
people, but everyone else should have been able to go on with their life.
Not only that, but it would have been such a better response had we focused on the people who were actually frail, the elderly, for example. I mean, one thing that really pissed me off during the whole thing was everybody was afraid. So even young people, when an older person and their family member, their parent or their grandparent came down with COVID, the family members stayed away from that parent or grandparent rather than going in there and actually ensuring they're getting proper water, nutrition, their regular medications to keep them alive. I think a lot of people died in that age group because they weren't getting proper care that you would normally give them if they just had the flu. You know, people would be around them, they could go in, but the thing that I had a lot of care nurses that were they had patients on hospice essentially, and they would go to their homes and check in on them, and they would find food on the doorstep that their family members left rather than what they normally would do, which is go in and care for their hospice patient parent. And they were saying it was shocking how many people, rather than go inside like they did every day to check on their family member, would instead just drop food on the doorstep expecting their elderly hospice care parent to come to the door and get their food and bend over and get it. I mean, just insanity, total insanity. And that, had
So
we
I just
said focus on the old, then we could have come together as a community and said, if you've got a neighbor that's older, do the grocery shopping for them. Go pick up the
yeah.
groceries and take them to their house, and things like that. Like we could have come together and rallied a little bit better for the group that's actually vulnerable.
And by the way, that's public health 101 is that you protect the vulnerable. In the middle of a pandemic, you protect the vulnerable. You do different things for the vulnerable that you would do for the population at large. But normally how this stuff is managed, like SARS-1 and other respiratory pandemics, is the ones that could really get taken out. You do maybe whatever the protection, or in this case, hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, and protection, and you optimize their health. You maybe they get some sunshine, their nutrition's optimized, their glucoses are under control. But everybody else, it's allowed to run through the community. And as it
Hmm.
runs through the community, the viruses typically get weaker. That's when you get herd immunity. And in the end, the grandparents are in a better position when you allow this to happen. What happened during COVID was the opposite of everything you've ever read about in a public health textbook.
Hmm.
Literally shameful.
Yeah. Well, all right, let's talk about January 6th. So you were not really a political person prior to COVID. You become a bit more political during COVID because you were forced into it, because people basically labeled you as right wing, whether you were or not, right? I mean, anybody that was
Correct.
against the mandates and against the lockdowns or any of these things that they were doing, we were all labeled as right wing, no matter how we politically aligned prior to that. I mean, I was like a left wing progressive, and they were still calling me right wing, and I'm like, okay. And now I guess I am more right. I mean, that's kind of what happened.
No, I always thought you're correct. I always thought that the granola moms would come to my side, right?
Yeah.
Because who wants to put this foreign injection in your body? And honestly, if Trump hadn't been in office, I think the left wing would have been very anti the shot for being experimental. Because when I think about traditionally who was mocked as being anti-vax, it was always people very much on the left.
Yeah.
I mean, and in fact, the Maha movement is really from the left. So it didn't matter. They labeled me right wing, so there you go. But I was not very political.
So what happened January 6th? So you were there.
Yeah, so I was there, and I was probably the only person who was there, not because of the election. Now, it is true that I support Trump, and that is absolutely where I am, but I speak publicly on what I know, which is medical freedom, constitutional freedom. We were violating our Bill of Rights, right to assemble, right to free speech, right to worship, right, freedom of the press. I mean, all of this was being violated. So I was very offended as a lawyer, and I knew a lot as a doctor. So that was my lane. That's what I spoke on. And on January 6th, I had a permit to speak on the Capitol grounds. That's a funny little fact that people don't realize. I was actually there with a permit to speak. I was one of 20 speakers at it's called Grassy Section 8 or Section 8, which is right to the east of the Capitol building. And when I presented myself there, they didn't let us speak. I still don't know why, but there you go. They didn't let us speak. So I was on the Capitol grounds for that reason. Now, I think everyone can tell that I felt a tremendous compulsion to keep speaking on this subject. It was very upsetting to me. So I was on the top of the Capitol steps and I just was speaking, and no one could hear me because there's thousands of people there. So I quit, but I'm kind of smushed up against the wall of the
Hmm.
Capitol building. And then all of a sudden, the police officers threw a flashbang into the crowd. The crowd got pretty agitated, but no violence where I was, which was the east side. And then all of a sudden, the doors swung open from the inside. And you can see on closed circuit government TV, which I saw later, that I actually tumbled into the building. Like you can see, it wasn't really anything I intended. I didn't go to DC with any intent like that. But you can actually see that I tumble into the building because there's a crowd surge behind me. Once I was in the building, I couldn't leave, first of all, because hundreds of people keep pouring into the one entrance I saw.
Yeah.
So I decided to give my speech, and there's plenty of video of me giving my medical freedom speech in the Capitol because that seemed like a good thing to do. And perhaps it seems crazy now, but one thing you'll say is I was very consistent. I certainly wasn't there to do anything else other than to speak
Right.
on medical freedom, and that's what I was doing. And then I eventually, left the building and, went about my day. And except, it changed the whole world, right? That day. And
And you were later arrested for this and jailed?
yeah, yeah. So first of all, I did not appreciate at the time what a watershed moment this was for the nation. My side, where I was, the east side of the Capitol, there was virtually no video out there. The only video most people have seen is on the west side with the scaffolding, which, some pockets look not great, like Antifa people. Where
Hmm.
I was didn't look anything like that. Where I was grandmas and kumbaya, and, it was a lot of people, but it wasn't hostile in any way. So I didn't know what was coming. But we had dinner the next night with friends, and they were very alarmed. And they said, when they found out I was there, they said, "Oh my God, it was an insurrection." I'm like, "What are you talking about? An insurrection?" It was bizarre to me. And then I got a message on my phone. One of my friends saw a picture of me on the FBI's most wanted list
Oh.
and a picture of me. And I looked at this and I said, "Well, who photoshopped this. I mean, never
Right.
did I think this was real. This is
Yeah.
really bizarre. And then I still went about my business. I had two more speaking engagements later that week. I kept them. I looked back on one that was taped, and I actually never even mentioned J6. That's what a different time it all was. I never talked about it on my speech. And then 12 days later, I was working at home, um, and I hear the most blood curdling scream in my life. I've never heard anything remotely like that. And it was the FBI breaking down my door, screaming at the top of their lungs. There was 20 officers in tactical gear with huge weapons pointed right at my chest. It was just a condo. They were maybe 6 feet from me when they burst through the door. And, I see the laser sight beam light, the
Oh
red
my
light on my
God.
chest. And I'm like, it was such a moment. And then then I got my ER training kicked in and I got very calm. But they did what they did. They put me in handcuffs. They put me in shackles. They walked me in front of all the neighbors to the car. My door's broken down. They take all of my computers and phones. And I had just started this new nonprofit 6 months earlier. It was quite handicapping. They drive us over to jail. Um, and then everything that happened was really alarming to me as a lawyer. I saw due process never happened. I was never read the Miranda rights. We were held as though we were huge, like cartel members of like the El Chapo family. I mean, it was absolutely so over the top. Let's think back. What do you normally do with a person like me if you think they commit a crime? You call them, you call their lawyer. I was pretty public at that point. You don't break their door down with an FBI
Right.
arrest. And by the way, it's a very risky thing. You've told all these officers they're going to get a very violent, dangerous person, right? That's their mindset. Why else would they be there in all that tactical gear? So the odds of somebody shooting somebody is actually
Yeah.
pretty high.
Yeah.
So I think that that's kind of their plan, is to end up with a dead person. A person like me would be more convenient for the government if I was dead. And then, of course, everything that happened, people know, the government went on to arrest 1,500 people. The media kept calling it an insurrection. Of course, it was never an insurrection. People who are conservative have lots of guns. If they wanted to bring guns and have a real insurrection, you would have seen one. But this was just people showing up as political protesters.
Right.
But the media and the government called us, and we were massively punished by the government. I couldn't fly. I was put on a no-fly list. I got kicked out of banks. I lost all my equipment. It was very difficult to proceed with my nonprofit. Um, Here's a little tidbit. My minor son, who had nothing to do with this, he was also put on a no-fly list. People I worked with who were married to people I worked with, like their spouses, were put on a no-fly list. I mean, it was very scary stuff. And it's a shameful moment for our
Yeah.
federal government.
So they took you
Yeah.
away. How long were you in jail?
Right. So I was in jail overnight for just 1.5 days. Quick Zoom hearing with the judge, who released me on my own recognizance, and then I was in the system for 18 months. And the other side offers me a plea deal, which, by the way, I never intended to take. I was absolutely planning to go to trial. I hadn't done anything, but turns out they were charging people like me with a 20-year felony. 20-year
Wow.
felony, 20-year felony. And this is a point that people have to hear, is that the government was so heavy-handed and they knew what they were doing. They needed to get J6 defendants to accept pleas right away, because if you didn't accept a plea, you get discovery, you get more press, and you could discern the facts. So almost everybody took a plea because we were being threatened with these 20-year felonies. I did. I changed what I did. And I know many people were like me. I couldn't face a 20-year felony. So I took a plea, and the plea I took, the government went from calling me a 20-year felon to like a minor misdemeanor. I mean, that also doesn't make sense. I mean, that's on its face inconsistent. So I took a plea for trespass. It was just a misdemeanor trespass. And when I stood before the judge was infuriated. And he took this misdemeanor trespass and he sentenced me to 60 days in prison, which was one of those moments in my life that was just shocking and overwhelming. It never occurred to me I would be incarcerated. That's unbelievable. And it was scary. It was very scary. And this is also why I wrote the book, because it is alarming that this could happen. I mean, I am as good a citizen as exists in America. You like me, you don't like me. That's true in life of everybody. But I mean, I've always been ultra law abiding, I would say, and ultra kind of compliant, climbing the to the highest heights, I would say, in America. I mean, to be a doctor and to be a lawyer and raise good kids. I mean, that's about as good as it gets. And you could throw someone like me in prison. And by the way, Kim, they threw me in a maximum prison. So, I mean, the whole thing was so over the top. And then I started analyzing this as a lawyer and counting up all the illegal things they'd done, the prosecutors lied, the FBI. It was just so much illegality that actually propelled me to write this book, which reads honestly like a John Grisham novel. Like, you're reading this and you just can't believe it, which is why there's so much factual evidence and proof I put in the book. There's
Yeah.
so many references. Like, you're going to read it and you're going to be like, well, that can't be true. And then you're like, oh no, she has all the references right here.
Is your book about
It's,
your
it's
experience specifically, or is it about, I mean, selective persecution, the legalization of American fascism? Is this about your story, or is this, what's the book about?
Yeah, this is my J6 story, but I
Yeah.
use it to explain how the infrastructure for fascism is already here. How did we get to a place where the FBI could send out a SWAT team arrest on someone that didn't meet any of their rules for sending out for a SWAT team? The rules
Yeah.
for sending out a SWAT team are prior violent history, prior gang affiliation, drugs, narcotics, violence, right? I met none of those. How did that happen? Oh, there's like something going on. How did it happen that the DC judges would call defendants in their courtroom insurrectionists when no one was charged with an insurrection? A judge is not allowed to be biased. Like, what is going on in our society that this what could have happened? We didn't get here by an accident. There were a lot of steps that had to have existed. How is it that the California Medical Board came after me for free speech? Like, there's a lot of fascist, tyrannical features of our government that have been very invisible. And my story was a really good way to show that.
Yeah. There are a lot of questions there, and how this could happen. I mean, you're bringing up such, I mean, many, without even hearing your specific case, many of us looked at what happened after January 6th and just the narrative that was around that. It was clear political persecution. And the fact that the fact that the government or just the courts or any of this can be weaponized like that is very scary. Very, very scary that it's already at that point that they were able to do that, that they were able to do that to
We
you.
we actually, when you read the book, you'll really learn things. So we had judges saying they're going to make. We had one judge, it was a DC judge, not my case. She said that the statute did not fit what Congress said the statute should be and this defendant, but she was going to make it fit. That's literally what she said. So in the Soviet Union, the guy in charge of the KGB, I think, Beria, said, "Show me the man, I'll show you the crime." That was, he worked for Stalin. And how do you see this District of Columbia judge who literally says the statute doesn't fit, but I'm going to make it fit, and not think of that? So
Yeah.
every chapter is a feature of what happened to me, and linking it and showing how there's a lot of tyranny in America and we just haven't really seen it.
Well, you've seen it up close, unfortunately, and so for so long now. I mean, you've dealt with this now for 5 years. I mean, do you
But you
think we're
know,
turning
like,
a corner?
yes, I am. I'm actually very optimistic, if you want to know the truth. Maybe I'm a little bit, not making sense, but I am kind of optimistic. I mean, you think about my life. I mean, what are the odds being a doctor and a lawyer, and my dad was a Holocaust survivor, and a person of faith, and then I was put in this position and I could interview all these women in prison and find out what's wrong with the Bureau of Prison. And as I'm going through it, I mean, there weren't really, I think there was only one or two other lawyers that were arrested from J6. Like, so I had this kind of opportunity to see what was happening and understand it from the inside. So I personally think that, like, I was put there for a reason, as they say. And yes,
Mhm.
we've turned a corner. Maybe we needed to just have all these terrible things happen so that people wake up, right? So people have really woken up. You know, people have really woken up. We take it for granted now, but Bobby Kennedy is like a lifelong Democrat from a pretty leftist perspective, but he was so mistreated by the Democrat Party so mistreated. And his story about how he was mistreated is astonishing. They took him off the ballot. I mean, just really big things. So mistreated that he actually comes over to the MAGA side, right? So you
Yeah.
have MAHA, America Healthy, Make America Great Again. And like these two populist movements are coming together. So I'm actually very optimistic.
Hmm. Speaking of him, what do you think about his latest op-ed about the measles vaccine? I just have to ask you about that real quick
Yeah,
because that has
everyone
really
asks me about
inflamed a
that.
lot of people. A lot of people are very inflamed. They feel abandoned. They feel shocked. They feel like here was somebody we wanted you to be Health and Human Services Secretary. You're in there, and then you write an op-ed saying, "Go get the measles vaccine." Like, what the heck, Bobby?
So I'm a little less upset than other people only because I know him and I know him well.
Hmm.
So I think he's stuck in a bureaucratic Washington situation where he probably sometimes has to do things he doesn't want to do. Is my guess. That's my
Hmm.
guess. I've I've actually had conversations with him about the measles vaccine. He knows it shouldn't. He don't think he doesn't know about it. He actually did a movie a while back called Medical Racism that didn't get much attention. He knows in that movie, which he produced, you can see him talk about the measles vaccine. Like he knows the facts. So
Right.
I think perhaps he was pressured. I think perhaps he's focused on making sure that they're not mandated, that you have the option. And I just have to assume his arm was twisted a little bit. It is
Yeah.
upsetting. This is why I didn't choose, law as a career, quite frankly, because you constantly had to do things that you didn't really believe in. But I know him as a
Yeah.
man and as a person, and I know these. I know just if you watch that movie, he actually talks about the measles, the
Well,
MMR
that's why
shot.
people felt abandoned by him. I mean, I think even Candace Owens
Yeah,
wrote and said, I didn't vaccinate my kids with the measles vaccine largely because of what I'd read from Kennedy. And so now here he is
yeah.
writing an op-ed in Fox News telling these parents, yeah, we're going to be,
I don't know.
get look at the vaccine.
So
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure what to make of it. I'm not sure if he received a ton of pressure. I
There's
I
probably a
don't know.
legal issue with it. I mean, I'm sure there's like this, from a legal perspective, and he's an attorney, maybe there's some liability. Like if the department doesn't say, look, also look for at vaccines, like there could be lawsuits against the government if something happens and they're not vaccinated. I don't know, maybe.
I'll tell you what I think people should focus on. First of all, it's very good that Trump, he was a first term president. Now he had a break, and then he's a second term
Yeah.
president. It's very different when you go in knowing exactly what the enemy looks like, and so that's Trump, and it's actually not Kennedy. So if he was being given this undue pressure and it's his first time in the job, he may make some missteps. It could have been that.
Yeah.
I want people though to focus on two things. We have to focus on free speech and fair elections. That's really it. As long as we have free speech and fair elections, we will be okay as a nation. We'll go through like these periods, of disinformation, but they will die down as long as we have free speech. So
Yeah.
people will make choices eventually that are proper about shots as long as they have free speech and as long as we have fair elections. So that's personally my goal, and I want people to be more focused on that he gets
Yeah.
out the information on these things.
Dr. Simone Gold, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being here and talking with us. Really love your perspective, and your story is just from start to finish. Your story is your personal life story is just really incredible and fascinating. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And the book is very amusing and entertaining. I read too much, and I won't write anything that's boring for someone to read. So go enjoy.
Well, we do have the link down below for the book to pre-order. It's not out yet, but it will be out in about a month. So, Selective Persecution: The Legalization of American Fascism, Dr. Simone Gold. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.